Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, demonstrating your value and impact. We are joined by Dr. Jackie Bailey, which I'll introduce to you soon. My name is Kevin and it's really exciting to join our guests today and yourself, and I know this will be a great session. I would also like to warmly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of countries throughout Australia, including where you are connecting from today. I myself are coming to you from Gamaragal land in Eora Nation. I pay my deep respect to elders past, present and emerging. I invite you to share an acknowledgement, if you would like, from the country where you are in the chat room. Currently on screen is a holding slide, a blue one with some text, some video boxes and of our guest speaker and Auslan interpreter. I am a fair-skinned man in my 40s and I've got a grey jumper on sitting in front of a black backdrop. Welcome to Creative Connections again, everyone. These sessions are specifically designed for you and it provides us some support and resources and a sense of collective reimagining of our futures and our practices. It's been just an honor to spend some time with you over the past few months. Also, before I hand over to Jackie, just a quick couple of housekeeping notes to review. Firstly, live captioning is available as usual, and if you need to, you can switch it on by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom bar. And if you're on a mobile, it might be at the top. Also, you can extend the transcript in a separate window if you find that a bit easier. We'll be running a chat, so feel free to share any ideas, thoughts, and comments in the chat room. And also, we will be doing a short Q&A at the end of the session with Jackie. So please pop in any questions you might have in the Q&A section, which again, you can find at the bottom of your screen. And our Ian in our team will manage the chat, the Q&As. If you've got any technical issues, just please raise your digital hand, which again, you can find in the bar, and Laura in our team will be able to assist. And finally, we'll be recording the session and we will be sending a link to this to you in the coming week. Also, you can find all of our recordings of our webinars on our website. And there's currently over 35 of these sessions available for you to watch on your own time. Okay, it is really with a great pleasure to introduce you to our guests today. Currently on screen is again a PowerPoint slide to introduce our speaker. There's a blue slide with an image of Jackie and some text to introduce her title, her organization. The image is of Jackie in a portrait shot and she's wearing glasses and a necklace. All of us in the arts are constantly advocating for the value of art and creativity, whether this is being done directly or indirectly. We know how critical it is for our stakeholders to engage and to believe in the outcomes of the work that we do. Advocacy and communicating and demonstrating your value is hard work. And there's no silver bullet, but there's always an opportunity for us to learn. And when things are changing around us, I would say that this is even harder work for all of us. So luckily we are joined by someone who has spent endless hours thinking and strategizing about this. Jackie has worked across her career with numerous artists and arts organizations to effectively demonstrate the critical public value that art and creativity play. Jackie is a massive advocate for the arts. Her work speaks for itself, and we are in great company today. So it's with great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jackie Bailey. If you don't know her already, Jackie is the founder and principal of BYP Group, which is a research agency, and has over 20 years experience working with government, not-for-profit, and across the arts. She's a leading expert in both creative industry trends and social impact in the arts. So it's with great pleasure to hand over to Jackie, and welcome, Jackie. Thanks for being here today, and I will just hand over to you now. And I think you're going to share your screen with us now as well.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Kevin. And hi, everybody. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Wadi people in the Darawal Nation, which is Wollongong. So lovely to be here. And just a quick description of me. I'm a Eurasian woman, short, wearing a green jumper and silver necklace and black headphones on my head. And Kevin attributed more than 20 years of experience to me, which basically just means I'm old as well. So there are some white strands here in my dark hair. So today I will be talking to you about how to demonstrate your value and impact in a changing world. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Now, have I shared the right screen, Kevin?
Just swap the displays for us.
Swap, thank you. How's that? Okay. Is that all good? You can see my slides? So I've packed in quite a lot of slides into this presentation, and I won't go through all of them probably, but I just wanted them to be available to you, subsequent to this presentation. There's also all of this information that I'll be providing you with is available for free on our website, which is www.bypgroup.com. So I wanted to start off, excuse me, by explaining what public value is. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of what public value is, and then spend the bulk of this session talking about how you actually can think about and talk about your impact. So what is public value? Public value, this is a slide with a kind of onion diagram looking at the various spheres of influence or spheres of value that a person or an organisation might have when we're talking about public value. So public value essentially refers to the benefits which are theoretically anyway equitably accessible to all members of the public. So that's things like public parks, clean air, the National Defence Force, and arts and culture. Public value can also refer to what people tend to value that goes beyond their own or their immediate circle's self-interest. So, people might have aspirations for future generations or the type of society they want to live in, the planet, the nation. So these are two sort of dimensions of public value. The way I think about public value is the kind of value that we create for different aspects of society. And also in terms of our contribution to history. So I'm just going to show you my next slide, which looks at the type of value that we could create for each of these aspects of society and history. So if you think about, well, this is the way I think about it. I think about the kind of legacy or bequest value, it's sometimes called, that we can create for future generations. So what we do that will continue to give beyond our lives. There's the kind of value that can be created for the nation. So that's things like statecraft, how a nation presents itself to other nations in the world. There's a type of public value which is definitely becoming more prevalent, thankfully these days, which is around ecological well-being and the kind of value that we create and share with the environment that we live in. There's the public value that we create for society, and that's multifaceted, but it includes things like the support we might provide for vulnerable groups, how we might contribute to social cohesion and bridging and bonding. Then there's the support within that kind of spectrum for specific communities. So that might be contributing to a specific community's identity, sense of resilience and strength and belonging. Then there's the public value that can be created at the individual level. So that's around things like personal development, perhaps aesthetic growth, well-being. and then cycle back to the legacy that we contribute. Well, it's not really legacy, but it's what we contribute to the long arc of history, and that's including the ancestors. So we're not always just contributing and creating public value for right now and for right here, but we're placing ourselves in that long arc of history and what kind of value we can create. Public value is a term that comes from the economic sphere. And like a lot of terms from the economic sphere, we've had to kind of adapt it and make it is useful, but we do have to adapt it and interpret it in our own ways to make it valuable to ourselves as well. So today, now that, and I'm happy to take questions about that, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the different dimensions of public value before really narrowing down to be fairly practical about what you can do to demonstrate the value that you create. So the key question that you ask yourself when you're trying to work out what value you create or what impact you have is, do you make people's lives better? That's the fundamental question that you're asking. People's lives, we're talking about people in the present, in the future, and in the past. And we're also talking, you could include inanimate beings in that, inanimate objects, the environment. But essentially the question that you're asked is, do you make people's lives better? You know, do you make this world a better place? That kind of big question. Now, to really break it down into a much more detailed, usable form, I like to switch from talking about public value, which is a useful conceptual rubric, to thinking more specifically about impact and ways to think about your impact. So this is a model, this slide that I've popped up here is a model that we call the hearts, minds and bodies model of impact. I'm a writer, not a visual person, so I just use these terrible smart art graphics and hope for the best. So this one is basically like the way that I think about the impact that an artist or an artwork or an arts organisation might have. So I think about the impact on people's hearts, people's minds, people's bodies, and people plural, society. So when we're thinking about the impact you have at the heart level, I'm thinking about the intrinsic experience of an art project. And that is really at the heart of all value, I would say, and argue that the arts creates, because that is the differentiator in a way for an arts project versus many, many other types of social impact projects. The arts delivers and creates an intrinsic experience which generates emotional response, personal resonance. It might be fun and enjoyable. It may create a space of what I call productive discomfort and challenge. Many of these dimensions, some of you will be familiar with from the research and particularly from the work of Alan Brown, from Wolf Brown, as well as the work of the Rand Foundation. At the mental level, the minds, that's my shorthand for thinking about how you may have changed a person's attitudes as well as their skills and knowledge. At the body's level, that's when I'm thinking about how you've changed the way that people behave, what they do in the world. So perhaps as a result of seeing your work or participating in your arts project, maybe they make more positive choices about themselves or about others. Maybe it inspires an increase in civic, economic or creative activity. Could be anything like that. And then at the society level, the people plural level, I think about that in terms of relational change. How we relate to each other. So that's things like how welcome people feel. Do they feel a sense of belonging? Is there a sense of community strength? Have you contributed to social capital? Now, obviously, all of this fits into that larger public value concept where we're talking about how we might contribute to that long arc of history. And that's the bigger picture. But here and now, I think these are probably some of the most useful things for you to think about here and now when you're thinking about demonstrating value. So that's all well and good, lovely words, but how do you actually know if your activity, what you do, has made people's lives better? So how do you take those concepts and operationalize them? So this is what I suggest you do. You ask. So you ask yourself, you ask your peers, and you ask the participants, you ask basically anyone you can get a hold of who's relevant, obviously. You ask, does my activity, and you don't ask this specific question, we'll break it down obviously, but essentially what you're asking is, does my activity have the qualities of arts activities which are known to contribute to social impact? And I'll explain why it's that way around, why you're not just asking, does my activity contribute to social impact? Because that's a very hard thing to prove, but luckily we've got some shortcuts that I'm going to show you today. Then you also ask, have the audience members or the participants experienced a positive change in their skills and knowledge, minds, emotions, hearts, attitudes, sort of minds, hearts, and behaviours, bodies, which are known determinants of social impact. I'm going to get stuck into what I mean by known determinants of social impact, because that is the shortcut that I'm going to share with you today, and which some of you may already be aware of. So essentially, most artists and arts organisations I've worked with tend to be in the position where they know they're making an impact of some kind, but they don't necessarily know how to prove it, or how to interrogate it, or how to understand if what they're thinking and feeling is true for their project. So what we suggest is a number of things to actually work out whether your project has had the impact you think it has. But the shortcut I want to share with you is about, if you don't have, $300,000 to run a randomized trial, where you subject one population to one type of arts intervention and another population to nothing, if you don't have those kinds of resources or that kind of mind, then you can do this, which is a technique we use all the time, which is looking at whether your project has fulfilled the criteria that the research has already shown contributes to social impact. So there's a whole body of research out there which shows what types of arts interventions have been proven to contribute to social impact, to changing someone's skills, behaviours, attitudes, sense of belonging, all those sorts of things. So what the process that we have come up with, and which is not just us, but many people use, many researchers use, is to look at the type of arts experience that you've created and whether it fulfills the kinds of criteria that we know are important to being the kind of arts experience that leads to impact, and B, whether you can show that arts experience has led to the known determinants of individual and community change. So the known determinants are things like learning, self-efficacy, so things like identity, confidence. I'm going to go into detail into these in a little bit, but just to give you a sense of them. If you've sort of supported bonding, so that's connection within a group, or if maybe your project was more about bridging, which is connection sort of between groups, between one particular group and others, increasing empathy. Perhaps it's contributed to decolonizing, a sense of decolonizing, which has been shown to support health and mental well-being, or healing, again, strength-based approaches which support people to regain agency and a sense of hope. Perhaps it contributes to what I call collective efficacy, and what it's called in the research, which is about community strength and resilience. So essentially, we know from the research that if you've managed to create any of those conditions are what's called known determinants. So they are known to determine or to contribute to things like health and mental well-being, changes in community attitudes, social cohesion, academic engagement. So rather than trying to have to go from your arts project to health and mental well-being or changes in attitudes or whatever it might be, there's this middle step that you can use, which is a very helpful shortcut. You still have to do it carefully and robustly, but it is a useful way of doing it when you, like most people in the arts have, you know, limited time and money. It's also a technique used in other areas as well, in health promotion and other areas of research. So it's completely legit. Now, I want to talk a little bit about those two things that we would try and interrogate, which I just mentioned. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what's on this slide, which is the positive artistic climate and the intrinsically rewarding experience. And then on the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about those known determinants of change. So to demonstrate, or to just understand, because of course, this isn't all about just proving that you've got something, but also finding out if you do, because you might not. And if you don't, you know, that influences what you do next and how you change what you do. So the two elements of this slide are around creating a positive artistic climate in your project, as well as an intrinsically rewarding experience. Because in our experience, those are the two dimensions of an arts work or an arts project that ultimately lead to the most effective, long-lasting type of change for people. So a positive artistic climate is about process. It's about the integrity of process. It's about whether you've created a safe and welcoming environment for audience members and participants. It's about whether the artistic concept itself was well researched. Was it resonant? Was it robust? What would your peers have to say about that concept? A little reminder as well that regular and active participation tends to be more effective than passive or receptive participation, which is just something to bear in mind depending on how much change you're trying to affect. When we're talking about an intrinsically rewarding experience, this is the language and the concept which Alan Brown from Wolf Brown developed all those 10 years ago or so, along with the Rand Corporation in Gifts of the Muse. And this is the concept that a person who participates in your project or experiences your work it receives intrinsic reward. So that's what happens inside them. So it's things like an emotional response, intellectual stimulation, perhaps a sense of shared experience, perhaps that sense of productive discomfort, which I was talking about before. So this next slide is looking at those known determinants of individual and community change, which I mentioned before. Actually, I kind of did go through these on that other slide, so I won't dwell on them now because I am going to come back to them again in more detail. Yeah, I think I'll just keep moving just so we make the most of our time together. So my basic message here is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to prove that you contribute to those known determinants of social impact. Now, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the arts experience itself and the three kind of forms of engagement that have been found to lead to the most impactful types of experiences. So I said before that it's important to look at the artistic climate that you've created, as well as the intrinsically rewarding experience. Now, what we also know is that in broad terms, the greatest sort of impact tends to come when an arts experience has these three elements. When it engages a person cognitively, and again, this is minds, hearts, and bodies, essentially. Cognitively, so if it helps them, say, if it makes them focus, you know, so they're really engaged. If you engage people emotionally, that's like the flips, that's the emotional level of engagement, so I apologize. Cognitive engagement is more like the intellectual engagement, so they focus. Emotional engagement is that they're interested and they're enjoying this thing, they're valuing it, so they're emotionally engaged. And then there's behavioural engagement, which means that because they're mentally and emotionally engaged, they're making an effort, you know, they actually come, they persist with whatever the activity is. Now these elements are also the elements of what is called hot cognition. So that's essentially cognition steeped in feeling. So if you manage to get people feeling and thinking strongly about something at the same time, in the same the singular arts experience, then that will lead to behavioural engagement and hopefully behavioural change. And that is why arts experiences are so effective, because they so often do that. So that is just something I wanted to share with you. Again, it's another case to make and another checkbox to see if you're doing those things and if people are feeling those types of engagement. Now, I've got some slides here about the evidence base, which I'm just going to zip through because they're all on my website, and the sources that you can quote are also all on my website. But I just wanted to flag it here that this is the kind of information that you could use if you were trying to make an argument for the impact that your project is having. So for example, we know that in early childhood, this is a slide about early childhood impacts. We know that in early childhood, regular music and dance or movement has proven to have positive social development outcomes for toddlers. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff we don't know, but we do know that. So, if you even demonstrated that you're doing early childhood regular music and dance or movement, and you checked that they're having a positive experience, they're having all those elements that we talked about that make up a positive, intrinsically rewarding experience, positive artistic climate, and then you're seeing that they are interacting better socially. Well, there you go, that's your case. You can demonstrate it. School-aged children, this slide is about the impact that arts can have for school-aged children. And what we have found is that high levels of arts engagement amongst school-aged children can positively predict. So those are all words to say we don't know absolutely if this is causal, but it does seem to be a positive predictor of adaptive motivation, so school enjoyment, so basically engagement. It's not a predictor of academic achievement, generally speaking, but it is a predictor of academic engagement. So you might, if you're working in school programs, this is what you can say about your project, as long as you do, of course, evaluate your project and make sure that this is what you're doing, that you have created the known determinants of these things. Arts projects this next slide is about the impact it can have for patients in hospital and clinical settings. The next slide is about the impact that it can have for older adults. Quite a lot of impact, as a matter of fact. There's quite a lot of research into this at the moment, which shows that arts is it's not so much a protective factor, but it correlates with improved dealing, I suppose, with dementia, that kind of thing. There's also a lot of research about how it improves, the Parkinson's for disease sort of activity that Queensland Ballet does. And so that's an area rich with research at the moment, if that's where you're working. There is research to show that arts engagement has a strong correlation with later innovation and entrepreneurship. And, those are, I was going to say buzzwords, but they are key indicators themselves. They are known determinants of economic growth. And of course, well-being. This next slide talks about how cultural participation can improve a person's subjective well-being, so how they feel about themselves and their life. Social cohesion. There's also a bit of research to show that the arts can promote what's called pro-social behaviours. So, being a good citizen, attending community meetings, volunteering, that kind of thing. Arts participation can raise awareness. For marginalised groups, there's a specially effective tool for finding voice, identity and recognition. And of course, arts participation can help with healing after traumatic events, as we know and as we're seeing, and as we will hopefully continue to see in post-COVID land. Now, the reason I wanted to whiz through that is so I can spend a little bit of extra time on, again, the nuts and bolts of how you do this, because I think that's often the hard bit. And it's work that we've done quite a lot with organisations, especially in Victoria, because Creative Victoria had an evaluation exchange program over the last 2 years and a social impact program. and we were their evaluation partners. So we had the opportunity to develop a lot of resources which are now available for free on our website, and which we've sort of mentored and tutored people in Victoria. So please avail yourselves of all those free resources if you need them. So translating all of that thinking into what do you actually do? How do you actually measure these things, the artistic climate, the intrinsic reward, all these words that Jackie keeps saying. So I'm just giving you an example here of what could be a very sort of basic arts project participant impact framework. So if you were doing an arts project, you would have one of these for participants, and you'd probably have one if you worked with audiences. You'd develop a framework for audiences. It's basically trying to capture in a table or a couple of tables the kinds of impact that you expect the people who interact with you and your project to experience. And you use it as a guiding framework for then going out and collecting information. There might be other impacts that happen as a result of your project. You might be completely off course, but at least it gives you somewhere to start and somewhere to start collecting data. So the kinds of things that you might gather, well, in terms of the intrinsic reward of the experience, that stuff about emotional response, personal resonance, engagement, you would just ask. So that is the question that would be answered through self-assessment. So that's basically surveys. Or it could be that you encourage participants to keep a diary, or it could be through artistic expression. So again, on my website, there's a lot of free tools as well. So it's not always just a survey. It might also be a visual style of evaluation where you get people to contemplate how they felt before and how they felt after an experience. Those are just a few examples. There's lots of other examples out there. And probably many of you have some that you could share with us. And if you do, just chuck them in the chat. When we're looking at the integrity of the process or the artistic climate, again, that's about asking people. And when I say asking people, I also mean asking people in a culturally safe way, which makes them feel that they can tell you the truth. That's a whole other conversation that we can have. But that's really about making sure that you don't go into, you've done this framework, you know what you think you've achieved or you're going to achieve, but you go into these conversations, or you get other people to go into these conversations who your participants may be more comfortable with an open mind, and letting them tell you how it's gone for them. And with the artistic concept, how do you test that? You ask your peers, you ask people you trust and respect, you ask your critical friends. Right, now when we're looking at the known determinants of social impact. So I've just picked 4 of them from that longer list that I provided on an earlier slide, but these tend to be fairly common to arts projects. So that's why I've chosen them. So in terms of a person's personal capacity development, which is also known as self-efficacy. So what I do is I think about what the person has learned and experienced. So that's skills, knowledge, and experience. What they think and feel as a result of the project. So, minds and hearts. And then what they do, behavioural change. So for an impact type like self-efficacy or personal capacity development, in the skills, knowledge and experience box, I might say, well, it was a music project, so I was hoping they'd get more music skills and knowledge. But in terms of personal skills, I was hoping they might, develop some ability to emotionally regulate or to think about their future. Say if it was a youth project or a project in a school, you might think about those things. Attitudinally, I'd be hoping that they feel more confidence and self-worth. Again, more future orientation. So that's basically a fancy way of saying more hopeful. And a belief in one's own ability to manage, can you cope? Behaviourally, so what they do, often you're not going to be able to prove this stuff unless you come back, 6 months and 12 months later. But it's just worth knowing what you're shooting for, because it helps you to shape the whole research approach. So perhaps you're hoping that the person comes away with a greater sense of their own choices and abilities. Maybe they're better completing tasks, or maybe they have an increase in directing their own activities as a result of this. Just conscious of time. So I'll just quickly go through, I'll go through these others. I think we've got time. What I will do though is go to my next slides, which break them down so they're not so tiny on your screen. So we've already talked about the arts experience. So I'll push on. That's what this next slide is. The next slide is about the personal capacity development, self-efficacy, which I just talked about. And now this next slide is about the participant impact in the realm of identity, which is also a dimension of self-efficacy, but it's just worth splitting out because it might have different sort of sub-dimensions. So when I'm talking about identity, I'm talking about whether a person has greater knowledge of their own possible identities. You know, maybe they haven't had an opportunity to try out different identities. You can see when I was doing this, I was thinking mostly about kind of youth programs, but this can still be relevant across the spectrum, across ages. Did they have access to role models that they might not have had before? Attitudinally, what they think and feel. Perhaps they've learned that identity is more fluid than they realized, you know, that they can change, that change is possible. Maybe they've reframed and got a different lens for looking at their own selves and their own lives. Maybe they've got a greater sense of pride in their own identity as a result of this experience. Perhaps behaviourally, maybe they express their own identity more readily, or maybe they just have a greater sense of their own voice and identity, which then informs other decisions they make. So this is the ripple effect. You know, you might not see it while you're there doing your project, but it's still worth thinking about so you know where you're headed. Now, how would you find this stuff out? Well, you'd ask people, you'd get them to do a self-assessment. And I'm not talking about a massive kind of psychological questionnaire. I'm talking about using questions that have been designed for that age group or that particular cultural group. You could use surveys, but you could also use interviews, yarning circles, whatever is appropriate. And you can also use observations, and that's, again, with young people in a school setting, you can do that. You can have caseworkers and teachers and parents offering you other perspectives. Now, I think I'm okay for time. Yeah. So in terms of, now I want to tell you about bridging and bonding, which is kind of the academic language for connection, which is such a central one for arts projects. So at the level of what we learn and experience, so the skills, knowledge, experience box, this is where we're just talking at the very basic level. Did you interact with people you wouldn't normally interact with? Perhaps, like, that's a basic but essential element of the chain that ultimately can lead to behavioural change or social change. Attitudinally, so how you think and feel. Maybe you now have increased self-respect or respect for others. Perhaps you have an increased belief in your own ability to affect change in those relationships because you're now seeing yourself as a member of a group, of a wider society that you can influence. Maybe you've got increased insight into other people. Behaviourally, ultimately, we might see an increase in civic activity, or maybe just a decrease in antisocial kind of microaggressive behaviours, possibly. Maybe an increase in social activity, kind of overcoming that isolation. So these are just some of the ways you can break this down, just to give you a bit of a sense of it. And again, how would you measure it? Again, self-assessment, so you ask people and you observe change. So if I was working with a group of elderly people, in an aged care home, then I would talk to them, but I'd also talk to their carers and try and see if they're, you know, joining in more, attending more of the wellbeing activities, how they're describing their day, you know, that sort of thing is also really valuable, as well as the kind of pointier instruments that you can use. I'm not talking about scalpels, like I'm talking about validated instrument questionnaires where you can ask people about their well-being. Okay, and this last dimension I want to quickly touch upon is around this sense of collective efficacy, which you could call community strength or community resilience. Now this is about the social capital in kind of older language, which still works for me anyway, which is around, so what we might learn and experience. So we might come away with an experience of increased connection, community connections, sort of within the community, whatever that community is and identifies as, and maybe knowledge. There might be increased knowledge of how to access resources in that community and leverage community strengths. Attitudinally, you might have increased positive views of the community's strength and ability to affect change. So a disenfranchised community might come out of your project feeling like they can actually do something to change things. Behaviourally, perhaps there's increased involvement within the community in community activity. Maybe there's increased community-led action. And again, you'd be using questionnaires, observations, self-assessment. Those are the main tools that we have access to at kind of low budget, and which also just work. They work as well. So before I wrap up, I just wanted to leave you with, got maybe 2 more slides. This one is how to talk about your impact. So these are just some tips on language, you know, which currently is useful language to use when you're talking about your impact and the value that you create. So I don't know if many of you listened to John Daly from the Grattan Institute, who did a session in the NAVA advocacy series not long ago, but he said this really useful thing, which I thought was very useful anyway, which is how the arts can talk about how it helps people to work out who I am and who we are. So I thought that was a really useful, easy way to think about it. Also, what you have there is you have the term arts and culture, which the think tank A New Approach has demonstrated is much better received than just talking about the arts. So talk about arts and culture. And what you also see here is very much a focus on the kind of liberal, small L liberal ideology language around self and individuated identity. So who I am and who we are. It's about identity and self-actualization. And that is useful language at the moment, whether or not you find it a useful way to think about your work. It could be that as well. Some other useful language, economic participation is a useful one. So helping people to be productive members of society, and how you do that, how the arts does that is through, you know, impacts. If you have had an impact on health and well-being, for example, then you've helped people be more productive, right? Health and well-being itself, sorry, that should be in bold as well. Health and well-being, helping Australians live the healthy lives that they choose in ways that they choose, I should add to that. So for example, we've found in some work we did with Vic Health that some people prefer to engage in physical activity through artistic means rather than, you know, going to a gym or what have you. So that is about giving people choices. And the word choice is a very good one at the moment in the current political context. Creating jobs. So, you know, creating jobs for young people in a knowledge economy. It's another way to talk about your economic impact. Building community resilience. So that's, you know, trust, sense of public safety. If instead of using words like social capital, I would recommend using words like community resilience. Actually, even instead of talking about personal capacity development, you might want to use the word resilience. I personally don't like using the word resilience in the conceptual stage, because to me, resilience sounds like having to, you know, just sort of suck up bad situations. I prefer to think about magnificence, which is a term I got from Jenny Briscoe-Hoff, who is this incredible community-minded leader down here in the Illawarra. And she talks about a person's magnificence rather than their resilience. But for the purposes of communicating your value at the moment, probably use resilience. Contributing to the Australian way of life. This idea of the Australian way of life is very resonant with segments of the population known as Middle Australians, who are kind of swinging voters. This is about national pride, national identity. It's not necessarily about a single, racist type of identity at all. There's a lot of pride in multiculturalism out there, but all of that captured within the language of the Australian way of life. Again, providing personal choice. I think we talked about that already. So what you do gives people options for how they might want to engage with arts and culture, but also physical activity, mental health services, return to work, employment options, small business development. That language around choice is quite useful right now. So I think it was Jill Bennett, who said in a Create New South Wales webinar that 65% of Australians who have mental health issues do not seek help through the traditional services. So that's a big swathe of people who might want other options for improving their own mental health, and the arts and cultural methods may be part of that. Return to work, massive area of government spend, workers' compensation, huge amount of money spent on that. A small organisation I'm on the board of, which was called Rumpus, is now going to be called something else, I think, Makeshift. So they're working on artistic and creative ways of helping people return to work sooner, because traditional ways of just going to see the doctor or whatever it might be may not work for everybody. So again, this language about options. Before I wrap up, I just want to quickly mention ethical considerations, which could be, an entire and is an entire kind of university course. But just quickly, when you're going about collecting your data and trying to work out if you've had an impact, be very mindful about who has the power in those conversations and those projects, and ask yourself, could you be misusing your power, even unintentionally? You have to be very mindful of that, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations, but really with anybody. Ask your critical friends, ask people from those target populations if you're being a bit of a dick, or if you're being too earnest or whatever it might be, or if maybe you should have an interlocutor, you should have someone from that community. Remember that your information that you gather, it should belong to them. So you might use it to try and advocate for your activity, but you should also always remember that you owe a debt to those people who've given you that information. And if you're going to use that information to support your own activity or your organisation's activity, you owe a debt to the largest sector as well to use it to support the whole sector. And specifically, you owe it to that community to give them that information so they can take control and have the agency to use that information to advocate for their own activities and taking charge. All right, now I've got a couple of slides there with useful resources at the end there, which you can have a look at. But that pretty much wraps up my presentation, and I think we might have time for Q&A.
Hi, Jackie. Yes, no, I definitely think we do, if that's okay with you. There's a couple of questions that's come through, Jackie, but before we do, thank you so much. That was spot on. So thanks for the effort that you've gone through in developing your session today. So we've got a few questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, just pop that in the Q&A and we'll try and get through as many as we can. The first question has come from Bridget Jones. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, Bridget. Sorry, I've just got my little daughter coming in to say hi. Come here. Hi. Hello, darling. Okay, I've just got to do this for a bit. Sorry, yeah.
School's come out.
Yeah, school's out.
Okay, the question is, can you tell us a little bit more about public value related to ancestors and how this was developed, or any sort of background or further knowledge on that?
Well, sorry, just quickly, you may have seen Ellie, my daughter, in some of those photos of school-aged children, doing music programs, because I was definitely that mother. Sorry, so good question, Bridget. It's actually just, and if there are any First Nations colleagues in the chat, I'd love to hear from them, because it's really something that I added to my own to public value, which is not really, I haven't really seen it in the public value literature, but when I was preparing for today, I thought it's important to put it in there, because there's definitely a feeling, not just from First Nations communities, although that's kind of where we learn a lot about that connection from, but also from movements towards environmental well-being and ecological well-being. This sense that we have to see ourselves in that, what I keep calling that long arc of history. And so that means understanding that what we do has value for us, but also future generations, and also our links to the past and our ancestors. And ancestors for some cultures are, you know, alive and kicking. And so it's important to bear that in mind and think about the value that you do or don't create for those groups as well.
Great. Next question is from Sophie, and I know that you've mentioned a few times around pre-designed questions or validated interview and questionnaire instruments. She was wanting to know as to whether there is a place to go and find some of these instruments.
Yeah, Sophie, they're all on my website. Like I love a spreadsheet. So I put together this huge spreadsheet with all the questions from the kinds of validated instruments that we draw from. So just go have a look there. Yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay. Well, listen, I think we do have run out of time. Sorry, everyone, if we didn't get to your question, but feel free to reach out to either us or Jackie, and we'll try and answer those questions. Jackie, any sort of final words as we conclude?
Not really. Just don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to delve into this, because it's really useful, not just to kind of advocate for value, but to interrogate value.
Well, listen, that's all the time we have for questions. But before we leave, just want to quickly highlight, we've got a couple of sessions next week, which I really encourage everyone to join. We are, first of all, next Wednesday, we are joined by Alex Reed from New Wayfinders, where we will be exploring climate change and provide us with a different framework and a lens to think about and take action on climate change, specifically around what's happening in the Asia Pacific region. So one not to miss. And then next Friday, we are doing a great session with Diversity Arts Australia and Creators of Colour on the topic of embedding art in research, so linking a few of these conversations again next week. Please join us for those and share these with any of your contacts that you feel will be useful to do so. Jackie, thank you so much again for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good day.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone.